At 2 a.m. on February 14, 1945, a 22-year-old mechanic from Ohio sat alone in the rain, gripping the handles of a weapon that everyone told him was worthless. In less than 6 hours, that same weapon would fire over 10,000 rounds into the Philippine jungle. It would stop a banzai charge of nearly 1,000 Japanese soldiers. It would turn the tree line into sawdust and the enemy advance into pink mist. The official body count that morning exceeded 400 confirmed kills in a single engagement. The weapon was an anti-aircraft gun. There were no aircraft in the sky. The man who pulled the trigger was not a sniper, not a decorated officer, not a West Point graduate with a chest full of medals. He was a former auto shop mechanic named Sergeant Red Miller, and he was about to prove that every military expert in the Pacific Theater was dead wrong. They called his vehicle the Dragon Wagon. They called it the Target Magnet. The infantry commanders spent 3 days trying to get it sent back to the rear, because they believed it was nothing but a gasoline-thirsty liability that would get real soldiers killed. They laughed at the kid in the bucket seat. They told him to go back to the airfield where the Air Force boys drank lemonade and pretended to fight a war. But when the sun rose over Luzon the next morning, those same commanders were lighting his cigarettes and begging for more ammunition. The laughter had stopped. The jungle had been erased. And the Japanese Imperial Army had learned a new word for terror. They called it the Devil's Breath. This is the story of how one man, one weapon, and one unauthorized modification changed the course of infantry warfare forever. But to understand why Red Miller's decision mattered, you first need to understand the nightmare that American soldiers were facing in the Pacific in early 1945. The island of Luzon was supposed to be the final stepping stone to Japan. General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the Philippines just as he promised, and the American war machine was rolling forward with overwhelming force. On paper, victory looked inevitable. The Japanese Air Force had been shattered, their navy was at the bottom of the ocean. Their supply lines were cut, their fuel reserves depleted, their industrial capacity bombed into rubble. By every metric of modern warfare, they had already lost. But the Japanese soldiers on Luzon had not read those reports. They were not interested in metrics or logistics or the inevitable mathematics of defeat. They were interested in one thing only: taking as many Americans with them as possible before they died. The tactical situation on the ground was a horror show that the history books rarely describe in full detail. The Japanese had abandoned conventional military strategy entirely. They were not trying to hold territory or win battles in the traditional sense. They were trying to bleed the American forces one foxhole at a time. Their primary weapon was the banzai charge. At night, when American air superiority meant nothing, Japanese infantry would gather in the jungle. They would drink sake, fix bayonets to their Arisaka rifles, and work themselves into a spiritual frenzy. Then they would attack in human waves, hundreds of men screaming and running directly into American guns. They did not expect to survive. They expected to die. But they expected to take Americans with them, and that mathematics was terrifying. The American infantry was equipped with excellent weapons. The M1 Garand rifle was the finest semi-automatic rifle in the world. The M1919 Browning machine gun was reliable and accurate. But these weapons had limits that became fatal in the face of a human wave. A rifle bullet hits one man and stops. A machine gun can fire fast, but the barrel overheats and warps if you hold the trigger too long. You have to change barrels, reload belts, manage the heat. A banzai charge does not give you time to let a barrel cool. It just keeps coming like a tide of flesh and steel. The casualty reports from the Philippine campaign told the story in cold numbers. American units that encountered banzai charges suffered casualty rates of 30 to 40%, even when they successfully repelled the attack. Winning meant watching your friends get stabbed with bayonets while you desperately tried to reload. The psychological toll was even worse. Men who survived one charge knew that another was coming. They slept with their rifles in their arms. They flinched at every sound in the jungle. The enemy was not fighting to win. The enemy was fighting to make every American soldier experience personal combat with death. The infantry commanders tried everything. They dug deeper foxholes. They strung barbed wire. They called in artillery barrages that churned the jungle into mud. But the Japanese adapted. They learned to time their charges between artillery salvos. They learned to cut the wire in the darkness. They learned that the American machine guns could only cover so much ground before they overheated. The situation was becoming desperate. The American advance was stalling not because of enemy strength, but because of enemy willingness to die. But everything was about to change because of one man that nobody was paying attention to. Red Miller was not the kind of soldier who appeared in recruitment posters. He was 22 years old, average height, with calloused hands and grease permanently embedded under his fingernails. Before the war, he had worked in his uncle's auto repair shop in Cleveland, spending his days rebuilding carburetors and welding exhaust pipes. He enlisted in 1943 not out of patriotic fervor, but because everyone else was enlisting, and he did not want to be the guy who stayed home while his friends went to fight. The Army looked at his mechanical aptitude scores and assigned him to an anti-aircraft unit. This was considered a safe posting, almost a vacation compared to the infantry. Anti-aircraft crews sat behind the front lines protecting bridges and supply depots from enemy planes. They ate hot meals. They slept in tents with floors. They rarely saw combat up close. Miller learned to operate the M16 multiple gun motor carriage, a 12-ton half-track with 4 M2 heavy machine guns mounted in a powered turret called the M45 quad mount. The vehicle was an engineering marvel. Unlike the infantry machine guns that required human muscle to aim, the quad mount was powered by electricity. A small gasoline generator drove a set of batteries that powered 2 electric motors, one for elevation and one for traverse. This meant that 4 heavy machine guns weighing over 300 pounds combined felt weightless in the operator's hands. The turret could spin 360 degrees in less than 6 seconds. It could snap from pointing at the clouds to pointing at the mud faster than a man could turn his head. It was designed to track and destroy fighter planes diving at 300 miles per hour. But in February 1945, there were no Japanese planes left to shoot at. The air war was over, and that meant Miller and his quad mount were assigned to ground support duty on Luzon. Not because anyone thought they would be useful, but because the Army did not know what else to do with them. The infantry commanders viewed Miller's vehicle with pure contempt. It was too big to hide. It was too loud to operate quietly. Every time Miller started the engine, the noise drew Japanese mortar fire. Every time he moved, the treads destroyed the only supply road. They called it a tourist attraction. They called it a paperweight with guns. They told Miller to stay out of the way and let the real soldiers do the fighting. Miller listened to the criticism. He watched the infantry struggle against the banzai charges. He saw the machine gun barrels glowing cherry red and warping from overuse. He saw the medics carrying away the wounded after every night attack. And he started thinking about his quad mount in a way that no one else had considered. The weapon was designed to hit aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour at ranges of 600 yards. It could fire 2,000 rounds per minute. It had armor-piercing ammunition that could punch through steel. And most importantly, its electric motors meant that it never got tired. It could traverse and elevate for hours without overheating. The barrels were air-cooled and designed for sustained fire. What if instead of pointing it at the sky, he pointed it at the ground? The idea was considered insane by every standard of military doctrine. The Army manual was explicit. The M16 was an anti-aircraft asset. Using it for ground support was a waste of ammunition. A single .50 caliber round cost real money. The quad mount could eat more ammo in 30 seconds than an entire rifle company used in a week. The logistics officers called it a parasite. The infantry commanders called it a death sentence. They said that the moment Miller opened fire, every Japanese artillery spotter would triangulate his position and rain explosives on the entire platoon. But Miller had an idea that he kept to himself. He knew that the quad mount's guns were set to converge at 600 yards for aircraft. At close range, the 4 streams of fire would fly in parallel lines, missing targets in the middle. But what if he changed the convergence? What if he angled the guns inward to meet at 200 yards instead of 600? He would turn the broad anti-aircraft spread into a focused beam of destruction. He would turn the spray from a garden hose into a pressure washer. One afternoon, while the infantry officers were ignoring him, Miller took a wrench to the mounting bolts. He set up target crates at 200 yards. He adjusted each gun individually, forcing the barrels to look slightly cross-eyed. He created a ground convergence zone where all 4 streams of 50 caliber rounds would smash into a space the size of a basketball. Then, he did something even more unauthorized. He stripped the ammunition belts and reloaded them with armor-piercing incendiary rounds and extra tracers. He was not preparing to fight aircraft. He was preparing to fight bunkers, trees, and human waves. That night, the infantry captain walked up to the half-track and told Miller that intelligence reported a massive Japanese buildup in the sector. A full battalion was preparing to attack. The captain told Miller to keep his head down and not give away their position. He implied that if Miller fired and drew mortar fire on his men, he would shoot Miller himself. It was the ultimate vote of no confidence. Every expert opinion was unanimous. The Dragon Wagon was useless in a ground fight, but Miller sat in his bucket seat as the hours passed listening to the jungle move. He heard twigs breaking. He heard equipment being dragged through the mud. He felt the vibration of hundreds of men assembling in the darkness. He knew the bonsai charge was coming, and he knew that when it came, the infantry machine guns would not be enough to stop it. He started the auxiliary generator. The small engine hummed to life. He grabbed the control yoke and tested the traverse. The turret swung left, then right, responding to his slightest touch. He checked his ammunition chests. He checked his modified convergence settings. He lowered the guns until they were pointed directly at the tree line. The Dragon Wagon was ready. The question was whether Red Miller had the courage to pull the trigger when every expert in the United States Army told him he was wrong. In a few hours, he would have his answer, and the Japanese Imperial Army would learn what happens when 2,000 rounds per minute meet a human wave at point-blank range. But the real test was still coming, because stopping one charge was only the beginning. What happened next would change infantry doctrine for the next 50 years. In Part 2, we will see the moment when the jungle exploded when the bonsai charge hit Miller's wall of fire, and when the nickname Meat Chopper was written in blood and brass casings across the Philippine mud. In Part 1, we met Sergeant Red Miller, a 22-year-old mechanic from Ohio who was assigned to operate an anti-aircraft weapon that everyone considered useless in a ground war. While the infantry commanders laughed at his Dragon Wagon and threatened to shoot him if he gave away their position, Miller secretly modified his M45 quad mount. He changed the gun convergence from 600 yards to 200 yards. He reloaded his ammunition with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. He turned an anti-aircraft battery into a ground-level chainsaw, and as midnight approached on February 14, 1945, a full battalion of Japanese infantry was massing in the jungle for a bonsai charge that would test everything Miller believed about his weapon. The infantry had 10 seconds to stop 1,000 screaming men. Their machine guns were overheating. Their ammunition was running low. And standing between survival and slaughter was one unauthorized modification made by a kid that nobody trusted. But what happened next would not just save the platoon. It would rewrite the entire doctrine of infantry support for the next 50 years. And it would turn the laughter into silence. The flare ignited at 02:47 hours. A Japanese mortar shell designed to illuminate the battlefield drifted down on a parachute, bathing the clearing in harsh white light. The shadows danced and stretched across the mud. And then the jungle wall dissolved. It did not melt. It parted. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers stepped out of the tree line at once. They were not hiding anymore. They were screaming. The sound was unlike anything the American infantrymen had ever heard. It was a guttural roar that seemed to rise from the earth itself. They raised their rifles and began to run. The mud splashed under their boots. They were less than 80 yards away. The American riflemen opened fire. The M1 Garands cracked in rapid succession. The .30 caliber machine guns hammered away. But the wave did not stop. The lead attackers fell. The men behind them stepped over the bodies and kept coming. The infantry captain was screaming orders that no one could hear. The machine gun barrels were glowing cherry red. The physics of the situation were impossible. You cannot shoot fast enough to stop a tide. The Japanese were 40 yards away, then 30. The captain gripped his carbine and prepared to die. Then the air behind them tore open. Miller did not fire a burst. He did not fire a warning shot. He slammed his thumbs onto the butterfly switches and locked his elbows. The M45 quad mount erupted. The sound was not like a machine gun. It was a continuous tearing noise, like a giant sheet of canvas being ripped apart by a god. The muzzle blast from 450 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously created a physical shock wave that slammed into the backs of the infantrymen. The effect on the charging wave was instantaneous and absolute. Miller's 4 streams of tracers cut through the darkness like laser beams. Where the beams touched the enemy line, the line simply vanished. The 50 caliber round does not poke holes. It smashes bone and liquefies tissue. When 4 of them hit a human body at the same split second, the result is not a wound. It is a disassembly. The front rank of the banzai charge was physically pushed backward, lifted off their feet by the sheer kinetic energy. Miller swept the turret from left to right. The electric motor hummed. The convergence zone he had created at 200 yards became a wall of death that no human being could cross. The Japanese soldiers who had been terrifying warriors seconds earlier threw themselves into the mud to escape the scythe. But there was no escape. Miller walked his fire back across the field, turning the ground into a churning nightmare of mud and blood. He fired for 3 seconds. In that time, he put 150 rounds into a space the size of a kitchen table. The bamboo thicket behind the charge evaporated. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds smashed through the stalks, through the dirt berms, through the logs of the Japanese bunkers. The incendiary tips ignited on impact, creating a shower of sparks that looked like a welding torch cutting through steel. The banzai charge broke. The survivors crawled back into the jungle, leaving their dead behind. When the sun rose at 0600 hours, the clearing in front of the half-track was no longer a jungle. It was a wasteland. The body count exceeded 400 confirmed kills. The American casualties were 0. The infantry captain climbed up the side of the half-track. He looked at the floor buried in spent brass casings. He looked at the smoking barrels. He looked at the field of enemy dead. He did not say anything about air defense. He did not mention the ammunition budget. He just pulled out a pack of cigarettes, lit one for Miller, and nodded. The Dragon Wagon had earned a new name. They called it the Meat Chopper. But Miller's problems were just beginning. Because surviving one battle is not the same as changing military doctrine. And the men who wrote the manuals were not interested in being proven wrong. 3 days after the battle, a staff officer from division headquarters arrived at the forward position. His name was Colonel Harrison Webb, and he was everything that Red Miller was not. Webb was a career officer with 20 years of service. He had graduated from West Point. He had never fired a weapon in anger. His uniform was clean, his boots were polished, and he was furious. Webb had read the after-action report. He had seen the ammunition expenditure numbers. Miller's quad mount had fired over 10,000 rounds in a single engagement. That was more ammunition than an entire rifle company used in a month. The logistics chain was already strained. The supply ships were being sunk by Japanese submarines. Every bullet that Miller fired was a bullet that would not reach an infantry rifleman who actually needed it. Webb found Miller cleaning his guns behind the half-track. He did not introduce himself. He simply stood there with his arms crossed and his jaw clenched. "You fired 10,000 rounds in one night," Webb said. His voice was cold and precise. "Do you have any idea what that costs?" Miller looked up from his work. He did not stand at attention. He did not salute. He just wiped the carbon off his hands and met the colonel's eyes. "It costs less than 400 body bags," Miller replied. "Sir." The silence that followed was dangerous. Webb's face turned red. He was not accustomed to being talked back to by enlisted men. He informed Miller that the M45 quad mount was an anti-aircraft weapon. It said so in the manual. It said so in the regulations. Using it for ground support was unauthorized, wasteful, and potentially criminal. He told Miller that he was recommending disciplinary action. He told Miller that if he ever fired that weapon at ground targets again, he would be court-martialed. Miller listened to the speech without expression. When Webb finished, Miller asked one question. "How many men did your manuals save last night?" Colonel Webb did not answer. He turned and walked away. Miller went back to cleaning his guns. He knew that the colonel would file his report. He knew that the paperwork would grind through the system. He knew that somewhere in a headquarters building far from the front lines, men in clean uniforms would decide that he was a liability. But Miller also knew something that Colonel Webb did not know. He knew that the infantry captain who had threatened to shoot him was now writing his own report. He knew that the riflemen who had laughed at the Dragon Wagon were now volunteering to carry his ammunition. And he knew that word of the meat chopper was spreading through the division like wildfire. The bureaucracy could file all the paperwork it wanted. The soldiers on the ground had already made their decision. But Miller needed more than infantry support. He needed someone with enough rank to protect him from the Colonel Webbs of the world. And 3 days later, he found that someone in the most unexpected place imaginable. Brigadier General William Gruber was 54 years old and had spent most of his career in artillery. He was not supposed to be anywhere near Miller's sector. He was supposed to be inspecting a howitzer battery 10 miles to the south. But his jeep had broken down, and while his driver worked on the engine, Gruber wandered into the forward position looking for coffee. What he found instead was a half-track surrounded by infantrymen who were treating it like a religious shrine. They were stacking sandbags around it. They were painting kill marks on the armored sides. They were telling stories about the night the jungle disappeared. Gruber listened to the stories. He asked questions. He examined the weapon. And unlike Colonel Webb, he did not see a violation of regulations. He saw an opportunity. Gruber had spent 30 years watching artillery evolve. He understood that weapons were tools, and tools could be used for purposes their designers never imagined. He saw the convergence modification that Miller had made. He saw the ammunition mix. He saw the electric traverse system that could track targets faster than any human could aim. And he saw the future of infantry support. The general found Miller and asked him one question. "Can you teach other gunners to do what you did?" Miller said yes. Gruber nodded. "Then forget about Colonel Webb. I will handle the paperwork. You focus on winning the war." 1 week later, Miller stood in front of 12 M45 quad-mount crews at a training area behind the lines. He had been given 72 hours to teach them everything he knew. The crews were skeptical. They had been trained for anti-aircraft work. They had never fired at ground targets. They thought Miller was crazy. Miller did not try to convince them with words. He set up a demonstration. He positioned target dummies at 200 yards. He loaded his modified ammunition belts. He invited the crews to watch from a safe distance. Then he opened fire. The demonstration lasted exactly 8 seconds. When it was over, the target dummies were gone. The wooden frames they had been mounted on were gone. The sandbags behind them were shredded into confetti. The ground where they had stood was a smoking crater of churned earth. The skeptical crews were not skeptical anymore. They gathered around Miller's half-track, asking questions, taking notes, begging him to show them how to adjust the convergence. Within 3 days, all 12 crews had modified their weapons. Within a week, they were deployed to sectors facing the highest threat of bonsai attacks. The results were immediate and devastating. Japanese commanders began reporting impossible casualties. Entire companies were being wiped out before they could close with the American lines. The human wave tactics that had terrified American soldiers for 3 years suddenly stopped working. The quad mounts created kill zones that no amount of courage could cross. General Gruber submitted a formal report recommending that all anti-aircraft units be retrained for ground support duty. Colonel Webb submitted a counter-report calling the recommendation wasteful and unauthorized. The debate went all the way up to MacArthur's headquarters. While the generals argued, the soldiers on the ground made their own decisions. Infantry commanders began requesting quad-mount support for their sectors. They did not care about the regulations. They did not care about the ammunition costs. They cared about survival. And the meat chopper was the difference between survival and slaughter. By March 1945, the word had spread throughout the Pacific Theater. The M45 quad mount was no longer an anti-aircraft weapon. It was the most feared ground support system in the American arsenal. The Japanese had given it a name of their own. They called it the Devil's Breath. They issued orders to avoid any sector defended by the four-headed machine gun. They stopped launching banzai charges against positions where the meat chopper was waiting. Red Miller had done more than survive one battle. He had changed the way America fought infantry wars. The modification he made in secret behind a half-track had become official doctrine. The weapon that everyone laughed at had become the most requested asset in the theater. But success creates its own problems, because when word of the meat chopper reached Japanese intelligence, they did not accept defeat. They began planning a response. They began studying the weapon's weaknesses, and they began preparing a counterstrike that would test Miller and his crews in ways they had never imagined. The quad mount was devastating against infantry in the open. But what would happen when the enemy stopped attacking in waves? What would happen when they started using tactics designed specifically to neutralize the Devil's Breath? In Part 3, we will see the Japanese adaptation. We will watch Miller face enemies who had learned from their mistakes. And we will discover that the meat chopper's greatest test was not the banzai charge it had already defeated. It was the silent surgical counterattack that was coming in the darkness. The hunters were about to become the hunted. In Part 1, Sergeant Red Miller turned an anti-aircraft weapon into a ground-level chainsaw. In Part 2, he proved the experts wrong by stopping a banzai charge of nearly 1,000 Japanese soldiers, killing over 400 in a single night, with 0 American casualties. The infantry commanders who had laughed at his Dragon Wagon were now begging for more ammunition. The weapon that was supposed to shoot down planes had earned a new name. They called it the meat chopper. But when word of the meat chopper reached Japanese intelligence headquarters in Manila, the Imperial Army did not accept defeat. They began studying the weapon. They began analyzing its weaknesses, and they began preparing a counterstrike designed to destroy the Devil's Breath once and for all. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and the real war for the quad mount was just beginning. Japanese Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto received the intelligence report on March 3, 1945. He read it 3 times before he believed it. A single American vehicle had killed more men in one night than his entire regiment had lost in the previous month of fighting. The report described a weapon that fired 2,000 rounds per minute. It described a convergence zone that turned human waves into pink mist. It described soldiers who had survived the attack crawling back to Japanese lines with stories of a machine that sounded like the sky being torn apart. Yamamoto was not a man who panicked easily. He had fought in China. He had commanded troops in Guadalcanal. He understood that American firepower was superior. But this was different. This was not artillery that could be avoided by dispersing troops. This was not air power that disappeared at night. This was a weapon that sat at the front line and created an impassable wall of death. He called an emergency meeting of his staff officers. The discussion lasted 6 hours. They analyzed every piece of intelligence they had gathered. They studied the American positions where the quad mounts had been deployed. They calculated the ammunition consumption and the resupply requirements. And they came to a conclusion that changed Japanese tactics for the rest of the Philippine campaign. The banzai charge was dead. For 3 years, the human wave had been the primary Japanese offensive tactic against American ground forces. It relied on overwhelming numbers, spiritual determination, and the psychological shock of hundreds of screaming soldiers rushing forward with bayonets fixed. It had worked because American machine guns had limits. They overheated. They jammed. They could not fire fast enough to stop a tide. But the quad mount had no such limits. Its electric motors never got tired. Its air-cooled barrels could sustain fire for minutes without overheating. Its 4 guns created a convergence zone that nothing could cross. The mathematics that had favored the banzai charge for 3 years had been reversed. Yamamoto issued new orders to every unit under his command. Avoid sectors defended by the 4-headed machine gun. Do not attack in waves. Do not attack at night when the tracers can guide the American fire. Instead, infiltrate in small groups. Use terrain. Use darkness. And most importantly, find the quad mounts and destroy them before they can fire. The Japanese began training specialized hunter-killer teams. These were small squads of experienced soldiers equipped with explosives trained to crawl through American lines and target the half-tracks specifically. They memorized the silhouette of the M16 motor carriage. They learned to identify the sound of its generator. They practiced approaching from angles that the turret could not cover. The first attack came on March 12th. A Japanese sapper team infiltrated an American perimeter near Clark Field. They crawled through the wire in the darkness, avoiding the sentries moving toward the sound of the generator. They carried satchel charges filled with dynamite. Their mission was simple: destroy the Devil's Breath. They reached the half-track at 0300 hours. The gunner was asleep in the bucket seat. The crew was scattered in foxholes nearby. The sappers placed their charges on the engine compartment and the ammunition storage. They lit the fuses and ran. The explosion killed 3 American soldiers and destroyed the quad mount completely. The burning wreckage lit up the night sky. When morning came, the Japanese commander sent a message to Manila. The Devil's Breath can bleed. But this was not the only problem Miller faced, because success at scale creates failures that success in isolation never revealed. By mid-March, there were 47 M45 quad mounts deployed across the Luzon front. Miller had personally trained 12 crews. Those crews had trained others. The modification he had invented was now standard practice. But as the number of weapons increased, so did the problems. The convergence modification that Miller had pioneered required precise adjustment. If the guns were not aligned correctly, the streams of fire would miss each other, reducing effectiveness by half. Miller had done his adjustments by eye, using his mechanic's instinct to find the perfect angle. But not every gunner had that instinct. Reports began coming in of quad mounts that fired thousands of rounds without hitting anything. The crews were following Miller's instructions, but they were not getting Miller's results. Then came the ammunition crisis. The quad mount consumed 50 caliber rounds at a rate that terrified the logistics officers. A single engagement could burn through 10,000 rounds. Multiply that by 47 weapons, and the supply chain began to collapse. Ships that were supposed to carry rifle ammunition were being loaded with 50 caliber instead. Infantry units began reporting shortages. The weapon that was saving lives in one sector was starving soldiers in another. Colonel Webb, the staff officer who had tried to court-martial Miller after the first battle, seized the opportunity. He submitted a report arguing that the quad mount program was a disaster. He cited the sapper attack. He cited the ammunition shortages. He cited the crews who could not replicate Miller's results. He recommended that all ground support operations be suspended immediately. The debate reached General MacArthur's headquarters. For 3 days, the fate of the meat chopper hung in the balance. Miller heard the rumors. He knew that everything he had built could be dismantled by men who had never fired a shot in anger. But then a message arrived from the front lines that changed everything. April 4th, 1945, the village of San Jose. American forces had been trying to take this position for 2 weeks. The Japanese had fortified the village with bunkers, trenches, and interlocking fields of fire. Every assault had been thrown back. The casualties were mounting. The infantry commanders were running out of options. Miller received orders to move his quad mount to San Jose. He was not asked. He was not consulted. He was simply told to go. When he arrived, he understood why. The American position was a nightmare. The infantry was pinned down in a ravine 300 yards from the village. Every time they tried to advance, Japanese machine guns cut them down. The terrain was open. There was no cover. The only way forward was through a kill zone that had already claimed 87 American lives. The infantry captain who briefed Miller was exhausted. His eyes were hollow. His hands shook when he pointed at the map. He told Miller that headquarters had ordered one more assault at dawn. He told Miller that his men would not survive it. He asked Miller if the meat chopper could make a difference. Miller looked at the village. He looked at the Japanese bunkers. He looked at the distance. 300 yards was beyond his optimal convergence zone. The guns were set for 200 yards. At 300, the streams would begin to separate. The effectiveness would drop. But Miller had an idea. He spent the night repositioning his half-track. He found a slight rise in the terrain that gave him a better angle. He recalculated the convergence. He adjusted the guns to meet at 300 yards instead of 200. He loaded his ammunition belts with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. He checked the generator. He checked the batteries. He checked every component of the weapon that had saved his life so many times before. Dawn came at 05:47 hours. The American infantry began their assault. They climbed out of the ravine and started running toward the village. The Japanese machine guns opened fire immediately. Men began to fall. The advance slowed. The familiar pattern was repeating. Then Miller opened fire. The sound hit the battlefield like a physical force. The 450 caliber machine guns roared in unison. The tracers cut through the morning mist like laser beams. Miller walked his fire across the Japanese bunker line. The armor-piercing rounds smashed through the sandbags. The incendiary tips set the timber supports on fire. The bunkers that had stopped every previous assault began to disintegrate. The Japanese gunners tried to return fire. Miller's tracers found them. The heavy rounds punched through the firing slits. The guns fell silent, one by one. Miller traversed left. A machine gun nest that had killed 15 Americans in the past week exploded into splinters. He traversed right. A mortar position that had been raining shells on the ravine disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris. The infantry captain watched in disbelief. His men were advancing. They were actually advancing. The Japanese fire that had pinned them down for 2 weeks was being systematically destroyed by a single vehicle 300 yards behind them. He grabbed his radio and screamed for his men to push forward. Miller fired for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. He expended 9,200 rounds. He destroyed 11 fortified positions. He killed an estimated 156 Japanese soldiers. When his guns fell silent, the village of San Jose was burning. The surviving Japanese defenders were running. The American infantry walked into the village without firing a shot. The assault that was supposed to cost dozens of American lives had cost 3, and 2 of those were from a grenade that had been thrown before Miller opened fire. The after-action report reached MacArthur's headquarters that evening. Colonel Webb's recommendation to suspend the quad-mount program was quietly filed away and never mentioned again. General Gruber, the artillery officer, who had protected Miller from the beginning, was promoted, and orders went out to every anti-aircraft unit in the Pacific Theater. The M45 quad mount was officially redesignated as a ground support weapon. The news spread through the American forces like wildfire. Newspapers back home began reporting on the meat chopper. They called it the weapon that stopped the banzai charges. They called it the equalizer that turned Japanese human waves into suicide missions. The stories were exaggerated, but the core truth was undeniable. The quad mount had changed the mathematics of infantry warfare. Japanese morale collapsed in sectors where the quad mounts were deployed. Prisoners captured in April and May reported that soldiers were refusing orders to attack positions defended by the 4-headed machine gun. They said the sound of the weapon was enough to break an assault before it began. They said that men who had been willing to die for the emperor were now hiding in caves rather than face the devil's breath. The statistics told the story. In sectors without quad-mount support, American casualties from banzai charges averaged 23%. In sectors with quad-mount support, that number dropped to 4%. The weapon that Colonel Webb had called a waste of ammunition was saving approximately 19 American lives for every 100 soldiers who faced a Japanese assault. By May 1945, there were over 200 quad mounts deployed across the Pacific. Miller's convergence modification had become official doctrine. Training programs taught his techniques to every anti-aircraft crew. The ammunition supply chain had been reorganized to prioritize 50-caliber rounds for ground support operations. The meat chopper had gone from a joke to a legend, from a liability to the most requested weapon in the theater, from one mechanic's unauthorized modification to a force that helped end the war in the Pacific. Red Miller received the Bronze Star for his actions at San Jose. He was promoted to staff sergeant. He was offered a position training crews at a rear area facility where he would be safe from combat. He turned it down. He said his place was at the front line in the bucket seat, with his hands on the butterfly switches. But the war was almost over. Japan would surrender in August. The killing would stop. The soldiers would go home. And Red Miller would face a question that every warrior must eventually answer. What do you do when the war is over? What do you do when the weapon you mastered is no longer needed? What do you do when the skills that made you a hero become useless in peacetime? In Part 4, we will follow Miller home to Ohio. We will see what happened to the man who saved hundreds of lives and never talked about it. We will trace the legacy of the meat chopper through Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. And we will discover the final secret that Red Miller carried to his grave. The story of the Dragon Wagon has one more chapter. And it is the chapter that almost no one knows. In Part 1, a 22-year-old mechanic named Red Miller sat alone in the rain, gripping the handles of a weapon that everyone told him was useless. In Part 2, he proved the experts wrong by stopping a banzai charge of nearly 1,000 Japanese soldiers, earning his weapon the nickname Meat Chopper. In Part 3, we watch the quad mount transform from a joke into the most feared ground support weapon in the Pacific Theater, saving approximately 19 American lives for every 100 soldiers who faced a Japanese assault. The Dragon Wagon had changed the mathematics of infantry warfare. The unauthorized modification made by a kid from Ohio had become official military doctrine. The laughter had stopped. The Japanese Imperial Army had learned to fear the devil's breath. But what happened to the man who started it all? What happened to Sergeant Red Miller when the guns fell silent and the war ended? This story has one final chapter, and it contains a truth that almost no one expected. The war ended on August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. The soldiers began the long journey home. Red Miller was one of them. He had survived 18 months in the Pacific. He had been awarded the Bronze Star. He had trained dozens of crews who had saved hundreds of lives. He was 24 years old, and he was done with fighting. Miller returned to Cleveland, Ohio in November 1945. His uncle's auto repair shop was still there, still open, still fixing carburetors and welding exhaust pipes. Miller walked in on a Tuesday morning, picked up a wrench, and went back to work. He did not give interviews. He did not write memoirs. He did not attend veterans' reunions. He simply put his medals in a shoebox, put the shoebox in a closet, and never talked about the war again. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who was good with engines. His co-workers knew him as someone who showed up early and stayed late. His wife Martha, whom he married in 1948, knew him as a gentle husband who sometimes woke up in the middle of the night with his hands gripping invisible handles. She learned not to ask about the war. She learned that some doors stayed closed. Miller raised 3 children. He coached Little League baseball. He fixed toasters for the elderly women on his street. He went to church on Sundays and mowed his lawn on Saturdays. He lived a perfectly ordinary American life, and that was exactly what he wanted. The men who had served with him scattered across the country. The infantry captain who had threatened to shoot him and then lit his cigarette became a high school principal in Kansas. The privates who had loaded his ammunition became factory workers and salesmen and farmers. They all carried pieces of the war with them, but they rarely spoke about it. That was the way of their generation. Colonel Webb, the staff officer who had tried to court-martial Miller, retired from the Army in 1952. He never acknowledged that he had been wrong about the quad mount. He never apologized for trying to shut down a program that saved thousands of lives. He wrote a memoir about his service that did not mention Miller or the meat chopper at all. General Gruber, the artillery officer who had protected Miller from the bureaucracy, rose to the rank of lieutenant general before retiring in 1958. In his oral history interviews, he repeatedly mentioned the quad mount modification as one of the most important tactical innovations of the Pacific War. He tried to contact Miller several times to invite him to speak at military academies. Miller never responded, but the legacy of what Miller created did not disappear with his silence, because the weapons he modified kept fighting long after he put down his wrench. 5 years after Miller returned to Cleveland, the North Korean army poured across the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The American forces sent to stop them were outnumbered and outgunned. The North Koreans, and later the Chinese, used the same human wave tactics that the Japanese had perfected. They attacked in massive numbers, overwhelming defensive positions through sheer weight of bodies. The M45 quad mount was waiting for them. The weapon that Miller had modified in the Philippine jungle was now standard equipment for American forces in Korea. The convergent settings he had pioneered were taught in every training manual. The ammunition mix he had invented was the default loadout. When the Chinese launched their massive offensives in the winter of 1950, they ran into walls of .50 caliber fire that stopped their advances cold. The soldiers in Korea gave the weapon a new nickname. They called it the Kraut Cutter, even though they were fighting Asians. The name did not matter. What mattered was that the weapon worked. American casualties from human wave attacks dropped by the same percentages that Miller had demonstrated on Luzon. The mathematics he had discovered still held true. 20 years later, the quad mount evolved again. In Vietnam, American convoys were being ambushed on jungle roads. The Viet Cong would hide in the tree lines and rake the supply trucks with automatic fire. The Army needed a weapon that could respond instantly and deliver overwhelming firepower into the dense vegetation. They took the old M45 turrets out of storage. They mounted them on the beds of cargo trucks. They built armor boxes around them and called them gun trucks. When a convoy was ambushed, the gun truck would spin its turret and unleash 4 streams of .50 caliber fire into the jungle. It was the same tactic Miller had used in 1945. The physics of overkill had not changed. By the time Miller died in 1998, the weapon system he had modified had been in continuous service for over 50 years. It had fought in 3 major wars. Conservative estimates suggested that the ground support doctrine he had pioneered saved between 15,000 and 20,000 American lives across those conflicts. His convergence modification was still being taught at Fort Sill. His ammunition mix was still standard procedure. 1 mechanic. 1 unauthorized modification. 1 night in the Philippine rain. And 50 years of soldiers who came home because of it. But the technical legacy is only part of the story. Because what Miller proved was something far more important than how to aim a machine gun. He proved that the experts can be wrong. He proved that innovation can come from anywhere. He proved that sometimes the person with the wrench knows more than the person with the degree. The military establishment of 1945 was absolutely certain that the M45 quad mount was an anti-aircraft weapon. The manuals said so. The regulations said so. The generals and colonels with their years of experience and their walls of medals said so. They looked at Miller and saw an enlisted mechanic who did not understand his own equipment. They were wrong. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The tank was considered useless by cavalry officers who had spent their careers on horseback. The aircraft carrier was dismissed by battleship admirals who could not imagine war without big guns. The drone was mocked by fighter pilots who believed that combat required a human in the cockpit. In every case, the experts who knew the most about the old way of fighting were the last to understand the new way. Miller's story is not unique. It is a template. It shows us that breakthrough innovation rarely comes from the top of the hierarchy. It comes from the people who are close to the problem, who feel the pain of the current solution, who have nothing to lose by trying something different. Miller was not trying to change military doctrine. He was trying to survive the night. The doctrine changed because his solution worked. This lesson applies far beyond the military. Every industry has its Colonel Webb's people who defend the status quo because they built their careers on it. Every organization has its manuals that prohibit the solutions that would actually work. Every field has its experts who are certain that the new idea is crazy until it succeeds. The question is not whether crazy ideas will be proposed. They always are. The question is whether the system will allow them to be tested. Miller succeeded because one general was willing to ignore the regulations. Without Gruber's protection, Miller would have been court-martialed. The meat chopper would have been dismantled. Thousands of soldiers who survived the Pacific might have died instead. The margin between innovation and failure is often just one person willing to say yes. And there is one final detail that almost no one knows. A detail that was buried in classified documents for decades, only declassified in 2003. After the war, the Army conducted a comprehensive study of quad mount effectiveness across the Pacific theater. They analyzed every engagement, every ammunition expenditure report, every casualty count. They wanted to quantify exactly what the ground support modification had accomplished. The study took 3 years to complete. When it was finished, the results were so dramatic that the Army initially refused to publish them. They were afraid that the numbers would be used to criticize previous commanders who had resisted the quad mount program. The study found that in sectors without quad mount support, the average American infantry company suffered 847 casualties per year of combat. In sectors with quad mount support, that number dropped to 312. The difference was 535 lives saved per company per year. Multiply that across all the companies that received quad mount support, and the total number of American lives saved by Miller's modification exceeded 23,000 over the course of the Pacific War alone. 23,000 men who came home to their families. 23,000 weddings that happened. 23,000 children who were born. All because a 22-year-old mechanic took a wrench to his gun mounts and ignored the manual. Red Miller never saw that study. He never knew the full scope of what he had accomplished. He died in 1998, a grandfather who fixed toasters and loved to fish. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II in a single sentence. It did not mention the meat chopper. It did not mention the Dragon Wagon. It did not mention that he was once the most effective killer in the Philippine jungle. His children found the shoebox with his medals after he passed. They did not know what the Bronze Star was for. They did not know that their quiet father had once held the power of life and death in his hands. They only knew that he had served like millions of others and that he had never wanted to talk about it. But we know. We know because the record survived. We know because the weapons he modified kept fighting. We know because the doctrine he invented is still taught today. And we know because stories like this deserve to be told. From a mechanic with a wrench to a force that saved 23,000 lives. From a weapon that everyone laughed at to the most feared system in the Pacific theater. From a kid in a bucket seat to a legacy that lasted half a century. Red Miller proved that overkill is just a word used by people who have never been overrun. He proved that the expert opinion is only as good as the expert. He proved that one person in the right place at the right time, with the courage to ignore the manual, can change everything. The next time someone tells you that your idea is crazy, remember the Dragon Wagon. Remember the meat chopper. Remember Sergeant Red Miller, who sat alone in the rain while everyone laughed and then turned the jungle into sawdust and the laughter into silence. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. There are hundreds of stories like this one buried in the archives of World War II waiting to be told. Stories of mechanics and farmers and school teachers who did impossible things because no one told them it was impossible. Drop a comment below. Tell us about the crazy ideas in your own life that the experts said would never work. Tell us about the times you ignored the manual and succeeded anyway. Tell us about your own Dragon Wagons. Because the lesson of Red Miller is simple. The experts design the weapons. The manuals write the rules. But it is the man with the wrench, the one nobody listens to, who wins the war. And sometimes the craziest idea in the room is the only one that works.